Thank you for joining us today. I'm sure a lot of you all are aware that e-invoicing is now the buzzword that's going on in Malaysia. All right. So what I'll be sharing today is a little bit more about this compliance of e-invoicing that will concern investment holding companies. So for all of you property owners, property management companies, if this is a big problem for you guys, then this is a video for you. Okay. So what exactly is an e-invoice? Well, an e-invoice is, by its definition, is a digitally validated transaction record that is reported to a government portal called MyInvoice, right? And this MyInvoice is basically handled by LHDN. Think about the difference. If you are running a investment holding company as a landlord, what you have been doing previously would be preparing these rental invoices in your accounting software, right? And then you send directly to tenants. But with this compliance with e-invoicing now, what needs to be done is not only you prepare the invoices in your accounting software, you actually have to do the same thing in the MyInvoice portal as well, correct? And what happens from there? Once you have basically submitted your e-invoice, LHDN will verify your transaction, and if it's validated, they will return you a UUID and a QR code as well. And whatever that is created and stored in the MyInvoice portal, you basically have access anytime for any purposes relating to audit, reporting, or any checking or whatsoever. So a lot of people are wondering, why is this e-invoicing required, right? They'll be thinking like, why are government doing all these extra things that give us a lot of reporting burden? Okay, well, to me, besides following the direction of the government, there are actually a few core benefits that I can see having this e-invoicing in our finance role itself. First of all, it's increasing the level of efficiency. I mean, if you are used to having all the invoices prepared manually, for example, now everything goes digitally. You are basically processing it a lot faster, lesser human errors, and basically you are involving much lesser paperwork in order for you to receive your rental income at the end of the day. And of course, this being a compliance requirement from the government, it's also to open up the transparency and having every set of data available for the government to do an audit if and whenever it's required. And not to mention accuracy at all, because I have seen a lot of business owners, a lot of property owners, when they prepare invoicing using manual way of doing using Excel, there are sometimes a lot of human errors that could happen. But with a computerized system, with a portal in MyInvoice, you are basically improving the level of accuracy because most of the entries are automated, and all this would cut off manual work and hence human error as well. And the last thing, what I can think of is basically the level of accessibility, right? There are so many times when you have all this manual paperwork in your office, in your home, right? After a few years, you would not know where are all these documents at the end of the day. But if everything is stored in MyInvoice, it would not be a mad scramble to keep on finding all these documents because anything that you need is already digitally in MyInvoice. So now I'm going to touch a little bit about the implementation timeline. All right. The Malaysian government has actually rolled out this e-invoicing mandate by 5 phases, right? We have actually passed phase 1 to phase 4 already. Now we are basically in phase 5. And phase 5 would basically be covering companies that are incorporated between 2023 to 2025 and generating more than 1 million ringgit on rental income. And that's coming to hit you next. So what do I mean by that, right? If you are basically in the first group, like what I said, the 2023 to 2025 incorporation group, and you are basically hitting more than 1 million, your deadline for registering for e-invoicing is by the 1st of July of this year, which is 2026. All right, so you don't actually have much time left. we are talking about a couple of months away. The second group, if you are a company that is basically incorporated between 2023 to 2025, but you hit 1 million in the next 2 years, either 2026 or 2027, but then basically LHDM is giving you a timeline of 2 years to basically register for e-invoicing. What do I mean by that? If you basically hit 1 million on the 1st of January 2026, for example, you are basically required to register for e-invoicing by the 1st of January 2028. But if you are actually hitting your 1 million on the 31st of December 2026, you are also given basically a deadline of January 1st, 2028. So as a matter of fact, to summarize, the 2 years itself, it does not matter which month you actually hit that 1 million. We are talking about the calendar year instead. Okay? And the case number 3 is, if you're incorporated 2026 and beyond, and if you hit 1 million at any point of time, it will always be the 1st of January of the second year after crossing the threshold. So like what I said, if you basically set up in 2027 and you hit 1 million in the same year, all right, you have to basically register for e-invoicing on the 1st of January 2029. So this is basically 2 years. Okay? So before I go any further, maybe let me shed a bit of light of what exactly is an invoice, right? I mean, if you are very familiar with accounting terms or finance terms, then this might not be for you, but please bear a little bit with me while I explain to those that are not familiar, all right? An invoice is basically a formal record of transaction, right? If I'm a property owner and I have a tenant staying using my unit, I would basically need to tell him or her how much is my rental income and all. And hence, I issue a formal record in a paper form, either digitally or manual, showing what is my rental income, what is the charges that I am actually charging to the person, or what are the ancillary charges that I am imposing to my tenants as well. I would also tell him or her when is a payment due and other details that I could put in the description box itself. So besides the invoices, there are actually another thing where we call credit note and debit note, right? It's relatively quite common to see credit notes and debit notes as well, right? Credit note would be something that we issue when we are talking about reducing the amount from the invoice that we have issued out. Yeah. For example, if you issue a $1,000 of rental invoice to our tenants, and we realize it's an overcharge because maybe the tenant only stayed 28 days instead of 30 days. What we could do, besides reissuing the invoice, is to issue a form of credit note to reduce the balance of the invoice. And on the other hand, the debit note would simply mean that we have issued too little of the actual amount that we want to bill, correct? Or we want to add, we want to issue additional charges on top of whatever that we've already billed without amending the invoice, right? So credit note is to reduce, debit note is to add on of what has been issued to the tenants. So if you are caught in this dilemma of being required to apply or participate in e-invoicing, what are the things that you need to do? You will be scratching your head. It's like, oh my God, what do I actually need to gather from my tenants? What do I actually need to do to kickstart this whole process? Don't worry. There are actually very few things that you just need to do. First, in order to comply, you need to first get the tenant's information. The things that you need to gather would be their full legal name. And when I say legal name, we are not talking about glamour name or any Christian names or anything. It has to be the real name in the NRIC, their identification number, their TIN number, which is their tax identification number, and the contact address itself or the residential address before you issue any rental invoice. Why I say all these are important is because in the e-invoicing portal, they would require all this information as well. And the second thing is to classify the rental services correctly. Well, our LHDN services, they have their own classification codes for each type of property rental service that you have provided. So you need to identify all these classification codes in advance. I mean, if you have problems doing this, you can always ask your accountant. And if you don't have an accountant, we could be the accountant for you. And the last thing that you need is to determine your document type. So whether you are going to be issuing a standalone invoice, a consolidated invoice if you're a tycoon and you own multiple properties, or basically whether you are also issuing a DN or a CN for your property portfolio. So this is basically a summary of what I have mentioned earlier. All right, just go through this very quickly. You need the full name, like what I say, the full legal name, the ID, the TIN number, and address, because all these are required in the system. So when you're ready to submit your e-invoice, what do you need to do? You actually have an option to either prepare an individual e-invoice or a consolidated e-invoice, right? And what do I mean by that? If you are an owner of a property, right, and you only have one tenant, then it's only logical for you to prepare one individual e-invoice to send to the tenant, right? But what if you have this unit and you have multiple rooms being created, or you have multiple segments where you rent out to multiple tenants? You actually have an option to do this thing called consolidated invoice to lessen your burden of submission. What do I mean by that? If let's say this whole unit itself has got 6 tenants, for example, you can basically combine or consolidate all these 6 tenants into a singular consolidated e-invoice to issue into the MyInvoice portal. However, the catch is, if a single transaction is above the amount of 10,000 ringgit, then you can't do consolidated invoice. You would actually have to do a individual e-invoice. So for an example, if you have a whole unit itself, a big unit, you have multiple small rooms or segments of it where your rental is probably 2,000, 3,000 ringgit, that kind of thing. And you then have a single space itself, probably a lot bigger, and you rent out to one person for 11,000 ringgit. You can't add all of this together as a consolidated invoice. The tenant that is basically generating you 11,000 ringgit would have to be on a standalone individual invoice to be submitted to the portal, whereas all the small little ones can be submitted together as a consolidated e-invoice, as long as the amount does not exceed 10,000 ringgit. Yeah. Oh, so this is basically a summary of what I mentioned earlier. We've spoken about CN and the debit note, so I'm not going to touch further on this. So if you're in the process of issuing an e-invoice, again, just let me summarize because I've covered this a little bit earlier. The 4 main steps that you need to do is to create the invoice using the software first, right? Make sure all the details of the tenancy and the property details are accurate, right? And then you do a reporting to LHDN through the MyInvoice portal. Again, like what I have said, the few important details that you would need is the full legal name, the ID, the TIN number, and the address of the tenants itself. And once LHDN has validated your recording or your input, they will be basically sending you this thing called UUID and a QR code. And once you have received that, you can actually distribute directly to your tenant on this validated e-invoice. So they will be sure that they're receiving the official compliant document. Okay, so this on the screen is basically an example. If a tenant asks you for a e-invoice, it's the same thing of what I've explained earlier, but maybe one thing I want to point out here is a common classification code that we usually use for individual e-invoice is 022. Yeah. Okay. Oh, so now this is an example if you are preparing a consolidated e-invoice for multiple tenants instead of the individual ones at month end. Well, again, some of the a common classification code we always use would be 004 for this case, right? And on the screen, there's an example of what we are actually trying to show. Assuming you are a tycoon, right? You have an investment holding company with a few properties altogether. And because some of the tenants don't usually request or require from you e-invoices, then you are actually able to do this via a consolidated way of doing. And what's the difference between consolidated and also individual? In the individual, it's a bit more burdensome because you have to ask for, you remember the few main things like the full legal name, TIN number, ID number, and address. For consolidated invoice, you don't actually need to do so. You are actually only required to gather the rental amount data from the tenants, right? And when you're in the MyInvoice portal, you consolidate all this information into a consolidated e-invoice, right? And submit to LHDN. And then LHDN will basically send you back a UUID and a QR code together. So as per what I said, this is a copy of a consolidated e-invoice that we issue to a tenant, right? As per what I've said, you don't actually need to ask for the tenant's TIN number, name, and all this because this is not required if it's consolidated form. This is basically a visual representation of a validated, consolidated e-invoice in PDF form. So now this is basically an example of if you actually need to issue a credit note to your tenant as well. As what I've said earlier in my example, you built an amount of 1,500, but you actually realize that the tenant had paid you an advance payment, for example, and you need to reduce the amount that you charge them. Hence, you issue a credit note. Again, the process is pretty the same. You identify first, you generate the credit note, you submit to the e-invoice portal, LHDN will validate, and you can issue this e-invoice credit note that is validated to your tenant with the UUID code and QR code to your tenant so that they're aware of the adjustment that has been done. Okay, and this is an example of a debit note, right? Similarly, credit note is to reduce, debit note is to increase. For example, the tenant, Miss Lee, was billed 1,002 ringgit for her rental, but basically you would have realized that, oh, I actually undercharged her by 300 ringgit. So instead of revising the invoice and send over, the company basically issue a debit note to increase the amount by 300 ringgit, right? The process, again, is not very different from credit note, but it's just the other opposite way. Identify the amount first, generate a debit note, validate in LHDN, and then deliver the debit note to the customer. So now we are at a stage where sometimes things can happen, things can go wrong. The question is, what if you are required to make changes on the invoicing? And when that is required, time actually plays an important part in this topic, right? There are two possible scenarios. First scenario is when you issue an invoice and you're submitted in the MyInvoice portal and you realize that the details are wrong. You are actually able to cancel the invoice if you actually do it within 72 hours. First is to identify what to cancel, submit the cancellation request, confirm deletion, and then you don't need to create any credit note, and life goes back to normal. Scenario two is when you intend to cancel or make changes after 72 hours. You will not be able to just delete off. You actually need to identify what is to be cancelled or amended, create a credit note for the full invoice amount or the partial amount, submit the credit note, and the credit note has to be maintained in the portal itself to maintain a clear audit trail. Both the original invoice and credit note will remain in the system after all. There are also certain circumstances when the company actually needs to self-build the invoices themselves, right? And when is this typically required? So some of the common scenarios that can happen is when you import goods from overseas. I mean, your overseas suppliers will definitely not send you an e-invoice. And when you actually buy things from overseas, you would actually have to self-bill the e-invoice yourself. Okay. Also, if you're going to be subscribing for services overseas, they will also not going to send you an e-invoice, and hence you have to self-bill yourself. And if you're going to be paying agents commission, paying freelancers or anyone without a company, very, very likely they will not be able to issue you an e-invoice itself as well. and hence this is your obligation to get yourself self-billed. Okay, so now I'm going to touch a little bit about timing requirements if you are doing self-billing of e-invoice. All right, when you import stuff or services, right, from overseas or freelancers, there are two different deadlines that you need to be aware of. If you are buying goods, you basically need to be aware that you have to do a submission to the MyInvoice portal 2 months, within 2 months. So if you're actually going to be buying at any time in the month of March 2025, the e-invoice has to be recorded in the system itself by 31st May 2025, 2 months. Whereas if you are actually purchasing services from overseas, you're given 1 month. So the example is if you are buying it in any month, in any time in the month of April 2025, the submission must be done by 31st May 2025. And to avoid all doubts, if you are doing an importation of goods, they don't actually look at the invoice date itself to determine the 2 months. You have to rely on the custom declaration date, or what we call the K1 form, to determine the date itself of when you actually need to do the submission to the MyInvoice portal. So all being said, now is basically to summarize your path to compliance as an investment holding company, right? Again, in order to make sure you fully comply, you have to assess your own business readiness, right? You need to determine your turnover and revenue threshold because that will determine when you have to get registered for e-invoicing. And second thing is you need to start updating your billing and accounting systems if you are basically hitting the threshold to get e-invoice registered, right? Because not all accounting softwares would be able to support the e-invoice requirement. And most of all, you have to start training, educating your staff on the e-invoice workflow because you wouldn't want to be in the stage when you are supposed to be on board on e-invoicing and then your guys are basically scrambling to find out what has to be done, what needs to be done and all. You have to also start communicating to your clients or your tenants. Tell them that, hey, I am actually going to go into e-invoicing and hence these are the things that I need from you, like the full legal name, the TIN number, the ID, the address, that kind of thing. And of course, with all being said, you need to do a final readiness check. I mean, if you have doubts of how to get started or actually to make sure that you're on the right track, feel free to always reach out to us. Bob and Partners Sdn Bhd, we are always ready for our clients.